Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video, we're going to be finishing up our little mini-series on what is nationalism, looking at what is cultural cosmopolitanism. Now, in this series, we're looking at three positions on nationalism. These each take positions on two central questions: what responsibilities and rights we have with respect to our nation, and whether nations should have a right to self-determination. Now, cultural cosmopolitanists, despite being in a series about nationalism, are deeply anti-nationalist. They claim that individuals should not have excessive attachments to a particular cultures and claim that nations do not have the right to become countries. So they give the opposite answers to the communitarian nationalists on both of those questions. Now, there are many types of cosmopolitanism, so this is important to set aside. In this video, we focus on the relationship of this family of views in connection to nationalism. So there's a lot of things that are called cosmopolitanism. We are focusing on something that's called cultural cosmopolitanism, which focuses specifically on how the broad worldview of cosmopolitanism talks about and thinks about nations and nationalism. You may hold the cultural cosmopolitanist view without holding the other family of views. They don't inherently entail each other. However, they are often held together. So you might be a cultural cosmopolitanist but believe different things about how states should be run. And we'll cover this a little bit. Now, this position that we're looking at, which is often called cultural cosmopolitanism, is very clearly in opposition specifically to nationalism and the idea of nationalism. Now, cosmopolitan is derived from an ancient Greek word for citizen of the world, not for alcoholic beverage. Broadly, this is the position that the only legitimate nation that anyone is a part of is the community of all humans. We are all one community and should not be divided by cultural or national lines. The cultural cosmopolitanism is not opposed to any one culture or even culture in general. Rather, they are opposed to the idea of individuals having specific relationships with a particular culture. For the cosmopolitan, or at least forced relationships with a particular culture. Let's be clear. For the cosmopolitan, we should build our ethics around universal, rational ideas of what is right and wrong, not out of a commitment to particular traditions which our ancestors followed. We do not have a right to claim any particular culture as our own. Rather, cultures exist to be celebrated and shared, to unite everyone, not to divide. We should pick the elements from each culture that are supported by rationality, at least in terms of values, and that we as individuals like and enjoy in terms of celebrations and traditions, not dogmatically follow the one we were born into. The cosmopolitan is deeply opposed to the notion of cultural appropriation, that it is immoral, and the claim that any one individual could have special rights to use a culture that others lack. The cosmopolitan is also deeply opposed to the idea that simply because you were born into a particular culture, that you should be forced to agree with the ethics of that culture. So if you're born into a culture that says that women should be oppressed, then the cultural cosmopolitanist is going to say that you have a right and responsibility to say that that culture is wrong and to not follow the normative dictates of your culture, because your responsibility is to a universal ethical background, not to the individual ideals of a particular nationality. So the cosmopolitan would argue that this is the logical conclusion of Rawls's argument about justice, though Rawls never took his arguments to the international scale. Check out my video on Rawls and the Veil of Ignorance for more information. For Rawls, we should base our society on principles which we would accept even if we did not know what culture or nation we would be a part of, what ethnicity we would be, what sex, what gender, what level of disability, how much money we should have. We should step behind a veil of ignorance about all of our demographic factors and think about what we would accept if we didn't know what we were to land into. Therefore, we should have no binding constraints to particular ethnic ideologies. Rather, we should step back from those and say, what would we rationally accept if we didn't know what ethnic group we would fall into? Such a society, according to the Cosmopolitan, would be one that would not divide us by nationality, but unite us as humans. It would not preference a particular culture, but rather rational, universal norms. The only reason that there is any opposition to these norms is because of irrational commitments to one's own culture. And if we set those cultures aside, we could rationally agree on the best way to do things and the correct ethical framework to live by. The Cosmopolitan would be concerned with the segregation of cultures present in both civic and, to a greater degree, communitarian nationalism. For the Cosmopolitan, if you love Italian food, language, and clothing, you should not be forbidden from it simply because you were born Senegalese, nor should you be forced to eat cebugen and speak Wolof. Any more than an Italian should be forbidden from eating cebugen, speaking Wolof, and wearing a halftan, or forced to eat pasta and pizza. Simply because you were born into a culture, it does not mean that you need to identify with or support that culture. You do not have a particular responsibility to that culture, nor do you have a special right to it that others do not have. A Hindu has just as much right to visit Mecca as a Muslim does, for the Cultural Cosmopolitan. Even if a cultural cosmopolitan admits that separate governments and states may be required, though this is deeply against general cosmopolitan ideas. Remember, this is a family of positions, and you can hold one and not the others, but a lot of people hold all of them. They think that states should not be based around culture or ethnicity, but around a common, shared commitment to rationality, rationally derivable norms of democratic governance and civil rights, similar to the civic nationalist. However, they say that we should focus all of our ethics, not simply our ideas about governance, around those kind of universal, rationally derivable principles, not around the specific ideas that we hold to simply because they were the culture or ideology we were born into. Within such countries, individuals should share cultures and not be forced to adhere to only one, or prevented from participating in another. It's important to note that the Cosmopolitan isn't saying we abolish all culture. Rather, what they're saying is you should not be tied to a specific culture simply because that's where you come from. You should share your culture that you grew up with, and you should share it with other people, and those people should partake in that culture and share their cultures as well. We shouldn't have limits on where those cultures have to stop. Now, there are a range of objections to cosmopolitanism that we will look into now and look at some responses that they could offer. So, from the side of the communitarian nationalists, this position is in grave danger of seeing communities and countries fall apart. According to the communitarian, without shared cultures and traditions, societies will devolve into anarchy. People need identities in order to define themselves. Cosmopolitanism strips people of what defines themselves, their traditions, their cultures, and their very identity. The cosmopolitan might respond that their goal is not to limit what identities an individual can take on, but rather to simply loosen the bounds of an identity. To say, you can have those identities, but those identities don't need to be determined by the culture that you come from or the ethnicity that you have. You, in fact, have a wider range of ethnicity or of identities that you can take on. You can be a pizza lover. You can be someone that loves Japanese theater without coming from the cultures that brought those things about. Someone's identity can change. Their culture can change and morph. It's not dependent on where they come from or their national identity. The cosmopolitan wants to let us hold these ideas loosely so that we do not choose our tribalistic beliefs over responsibility to all of humanity. For the cosmopolitan, we should never have a responsibility to an in-group that overrides our responsibility to all of humanity. It is not our culture that defines us, but our actions in relation to others. One might be further concerned that there are no instances of real, viable cosmopolitan societies. Even if the position is preferable in the abstract, it may not be viable in reality. Though imperfect, there have been instances of both civic and communitarian nationalism, where multiple nations are united under one country, and where there are nation states that are the entire government is built on a national identity. Many cosmopolitans acknowledge that their project is unlikely to succeed, particularly given that cultural cosmopolitanism is a member of one of the family of views that support an abolition of a range of things that are not likely. However, they might respond by claiming that this does not mean that it is not something that we should strive for, nor does it mean that we can say that the ideas of civic nationalism or communitarian nationalism are fully supported. We can try to support a cosmopolitan worldview, and we can support ethical policies and ethical ideologies and conversations that support the idea of cosmopolitan, that culture is something to be shared, not something that people should be confined to, even if we may not get to the point of completely allowing countries to have people that shift freely between nations. The complete separation of our connections to these identities that divide us may not be possible, but it may be possible to move in that direction by loosening these bonds that prevent us from caring for anyone, regardless of their nation. We may not be able to fully separate people from their cultural identities. But the cosmopolitan says, if we can loosen those ties and let people see others from the other perspective, they'll be less likely to wage war against them, whether that's through oppressing minority nations in a civic nationalist society or fighting other nation states in a communitarian society. The idea for the cosmopolitan is the more we can blend cultures, the less likely people will be to fight each other or to have these deep, completely diverging or disparate views. Another objection that has also been leveled against Rawls might be that cosmopolitans do not account for historic injustices. Some groups may have been historically marginalized, and many believe that they deserve recompense for previous treatment that they experienced solely because of their nation, culture, or ethnicity. And abolishing these ideas of you have certain rights because of your culture or ethnicity means that those individuals will not get effectively reparations or made whole for the historic injustices that have been done to their society. Now, the cosmopolitan could respond to this in a variety of ways. They might argue, for example, that retributive justice that punishes the perpetrators can contribute to a cycle of violence, while restorative justice is a way to move past conflict and heal the wounds of past atrocities for both the perpetrators and the victims without kind of focusing on the punishment and reward, the zero-sum game of traditional Western retributive justice. It may mean that cosmopolitanism takes time to achieve, but that does not mean that it's the wrong direction to go in, simply that there's a process that we need to go through to get there. For more on these ideas and how they were applied after apartheid, check out my video on Ubuntu philosophy. Another objection to both this and civic nationalism is that ideals of rationality, democracy, or human rights are not universal goods, but rather the product of the culture that is in power. And therefore, this is one culture, often Western or white culture, simply imposing its ideas on everyone else and claiming to be something that's based in rationality or universalized ethics. And therefore, all we're doing is simply imposing one national view over another, so we should just go back to communitarian nationalism because that's the only thing that is actually working. Now, the cosmopolitan might respond in a range of ways similarly. They might claim that these philosophies, such as democracy, human rights, are a product of the mixings of many different cultures, and they have shown up. There are people from all cultures that have argued for things like civil rights. And simply because one culture has adopted them more, it does not follow that they are owned by that culture or that that culture is imposing them on other cultures. If there are minority communities across the world that support ideas of civil rights, that doesn't speak to this being a particularly Western notion, even if Western governments may be the only governments that have adopted them. if there are many nations around the world that are minority nations in countries that have majority governments that don't believe in civil rights, that, if anything, speaks to the universality of civil rights, as opposed to an idea that it's solely Western or a white culture. They might also respond simply through a defense of moral realism, that there is actually a right and wrong about the world, which means that necessarily some cultures, when they have values and ideas about ethics, will be right and others may be wrong. The objector to the cosmopolitan in this situation is effectively arguing that, you know what, you saying that things like women have rights, that's just your culture's opinion. Other cultures disagree, and there's nothing you can say about that. And that kind of ethical position has a range of problems that can be objected to. Now, they might defend them, but there's a range of issues there. If you're curious for some views on this related to international development, check out my series on the Wahale method of development. Now, the cosmopolitan may hold, that many elements of quote-unquote Western culture are wrong, i.e. the comment about restorative versus retributive justice. It may support a range of kind of quote-unquote non-Western ideologies, but some are right. Democracy, civil rights, these kinds of things. These elements are chosen based on their accuracy, their effectiveness, their ethicalness, not based on a particular bias towards a certain culture. So, what do you think? Are cultures and nations really required to hold countries together, or can we shed them completely? Should everyone have equal rights to the products of cultures, or do certain people own their own culture? If it's so, who's allowed to own their culture and who's not? And are we allowed to share cultures? Are people allowed to kind of engage in that dialogue and participation within other cultures' activities? And if there's certain restraints on that, what are they? Are people forced to maintain their culture even if they disagree with it or think that it's wrong? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.